Thank you very much for inviting me to speak at this conference. I have to say how pleased I am to be here. First of all, I thought this morning's introduction resonated so much with me that we are reminded yet again that education is without doubt the most important thing we all do, that anybody can do, and in solving the great global problems that were presented to us around inequality, I'm proud to be with colleagues to pursue such an endeavour. And secondly, as an Englishman, I'm particularly pleased to be in Paris on the 28th and the 29th of March. I can't think of anywhere I'd rather be as we head for the great disaster that our nation's decided to take on. So thank you for inviting me. What I'd like to do is move the conversation to a slightly different place, which I think we started in the discussion at the end of the last session, which is about how do you mobilize the evidence? How do you make great use of these wonderful insights that we're receiving from academics? And how do you build a different ecosystem, as I might call it, to bring together the collaboration and the endeavor to learn more about how children learn? The Education Endowment Foundation, it's very important, I tell you, is an independent organization that sits outside of government. Now, in England, that's really important because if you're trying to encourage teachers, early years practitioners, health professionals, whoever is working with our children to change their behavior, and in the end, we need adults to change their behaviors, they don't trust government for that message. They're looking to ask the question, who is it we trust? Who will we receive the messages from? And it turns out to be colleagues, to be peers. When you strip me to my bones, I'm an early years teacher. I started teaching in London 36 years ago. I've worked in academia, I've worked in government, I've worked in many bits of life, but in the end, I'm talking as a teacher to a teacher, or as an academic to an academic. Who tells you what to do? Who do you trust? I think it's fundamental to the question of how you mobilize knowledge and how you mobilize evidence so it becomes part of our practice. The second key point on that endeavor, that point is, what is the mission? What is the moral purpose for our work? Well, the moral purpose for our work, as we heard earlier in many of our countries, is the great scandal that the wealth of your family still has so much bearing on the education success. And I thought the diagram we saw earlier of the football pitch sloping was such a brilliant image. Was it reminds you, and this chart shows you, that in England, as in many countries in the world, education isn't leveling the field. In fact, the gap for someone who arrives at school from low income is widening while you're at school. What can we do in education to ensure that our provision is meeting the needs of the children who need it most? And we're narrowing those gaps and we're producing greater equality. Because inequality and growing inequality and exclusion, I think, is one of the great risks and great fears of the future in many sorts of ways, and education has to be part, not the only player or only part, but a part of tackling that question. More money in education isn't necessarily the answer. This chart shows you that in England we had a period in the last 15 years where we've had more money in education than ever before. And there is no direct relationship between more money and better outcomes. The big question, and someone else raised it earlier, is how do we learn to spend the money we have wisely? More importantly, how do we learn to use the precious time that teachers have wisely? And even more importantly, how do we use the time that children give us, the once-in-a-lifetime chance to be at school? How do we get them to use that time wisely? And my view is that we're not efficient as we could be. We could be doing things more effectively, but we need to understand more about that. We need to investigate with rigor to find out more about what works or what worked for somebody else and what's less efficient and what might not be the best way to go about the core business of teaching children. So as the Education Endowment Foundation, we've decided that there are three pieces to this ecosystem that I'm going to talk about quickly this afternoon. The first is that we have to bring to the table what we already know. The great thing about a conference like this is you remind yourself that across the world there is a collective inquiry about learning. But if you're a teacher in a classroom or you're a principal running a school, it's very difficult to get your hands on this knowledge. We aren't great brokers of this knowledge. Ironically, in education, we're not very good at moving knowledge around. So how do we make the knowledge available to each other? How do we share together what we've already learned and start from what we know? The second element I'm going to talk about is there are huge gaps in our knowledge. There's a whole set of innovation, of inquiry that we need to keep working on. There's need for more and more research. But I think there's a way of doing research which is going to be more beneficial and more powerful than some of the current models. And finally, and perhaps surprisingly the most difficult thing of all, as we found in the UK, is mobilizing the knowledge. Putting it in the hands of a teacher in a way that they can change their practice turns out to be much more difficult than anything else. And we need to get serious about the science of mobilizing knowledge and the science of implementation. So very quickly, the evidence synthesis. This diagram here shows you the top page of a resource known as the Teaching and Learning Toolkit. This has been translated into Spanish, into Portuguese, into Catalan. We very much would love to translate it into French. People are working on the Japanese version now. And all it does is basically bring together the studies that we have found from around the world since 1980. So there are about 13,500 research studies under this page. And what we've done with these studies is synthesize them and come to an accessible format that we think helps people make a decision. Doesn't tell anybody what to do. It doesn't say you must do this. It says, on average, previously in studies where people have investigated these questions, this is what they found. And just to explain it to you very quickly, you take any kind of theme, and we started with 11, and teachers and others would say to us, Kevin, you need to add more themes. What about social emotional learning? So we added that theme. And we've a team of academics in the University of Durham who keep doing this work, crunching, reading the studies. Like hamsters in a wheel, they love this activity apparently. And they're reading the studies, filleting them for ones that have a degree of control, of experimental design, and then saying on average, this is what we've learned. And we present at this level 3 bits of information. We say on average, when people implemented this change, this is what it costs. Now that code, the more pound signs colored in, the more expensive, you might think. But actually, if you go into that, you tab on that on the internet, on the website, you would see that it tells you a cost per child, per class, per school. It's a metrics of cost. And in education, cost matters. Because the one thing teachers and head teachers will tell you is they don't have enough money. So we need to know how much things cost. The second metric is those padlocks. Some people call them handbags. I think they're padlocks. But anyway, those padlocks are about security. They're about how secure is the evidence. How good are the studies? How many studies? How many children? The more padlocks, the more security. It gives you more confidence. Not all evidence has the same value. We have to have a conversation about what is the quality, the shape, the nature of evidence in the design. So the more padlocks, the more quality, the more security. And finally, those numbers, the pluses and the minuses and the zeros, people get very excited by those. They're effect sizes, and they're converted to a metrics of how many more months of progress, on average, does a child make in a school year when those studies were evaluated. Now, we use that metrics because we think it speaks to teachers. We could have left effect sizes. We could have left a numerical value in there. And when we tested this with teachers, they said they found that much more appealing. That mattered to them, and they're immediately engaged. So part of my points will be that the minute you want to go to make your work more accessible, you have to make a compromise. And the compromise here, of course, is that the effect size is we've used the average of 11-year-olds. And you will know if you're an academic that the effect size of moving young children is easier than older children. So you're averaging, and underneath averages are huge risks. But what we believe is that the toolkit starts a conversation in a different place. So that's the first thing. You can synthesize what you know. You can click on any of those, and you'll end up going to all the studies themselves if you want to. You'll go to pages that describe what they mean. You'll go to bits that tell you resources and videos of teachers talking about the work. But it starts the conversation somewhere else. It starts it on a democratic field of the evidence rather than I'm in charge, I know. I have a louder voice than you, therefore my opinion counts more than yours. It says, let's start together from what we know and make that the opening. The other thing about the evidence base, and this is the same information presented in a different format, the other thing about the evidence that's absolutely critical, is this the biggest effect sizes aren't about things that governments do. They're not about things that you do structurally. These are about the decisions that teachers make in their classroom. And this is the really important point for me. If you really want to make change in children's progress, you have to work with teachers on the ground to change the behaviors in classrooms. That is where the action happens. And in any system, a decision that a teacher makes to provide more feedback or powerful feedback to their children is made as they cross the threshold and begin teaching their class. This explains the variation between classes, the variation between schools, and the variation between countries even. It's about the quality of the practice of the teacher. And this explains that that's where we must focus our attention. Beyond the synthesis, you then have this question around new research. There's new science all the time. We heard so much about it this morning. How do we conduct research in a way that involves the profession, is answering questions of real interest, and is conducted in a way that is high value? And I think this is a never-ending inquiry. The numbers here are important. We've existed for 8 years as a charity, and when we first began, we were told that teachers in England wouldn't do randomized controlled trials. They were too hard. We'd only done 10 in the previous decade in our country. You can see that in the last 8 years, these numbers explain that we've now done almost 200 studies. 1 in 2 schools in England are involved in a trial that we fund. Well over 1 million children. When you invite teachers into this world, we have found that there is no reticence to be partners. It's about us stepping into that space, leaning in, rather than conducting it in, I think, a rather isolated and sometimes ivory tower approach. And so I'm very excited by the fact that the profession in England wants to be part of the research, and we're finding exactly the same thing as we do studies now in other countries. So this to me is the exciting element of the future. How do we bring teachers in so we're answering questions that are relevant to their practice? I wanted to show you just a few of the results and a few of the studies. I've just pulled out a group here, and these relate to metacognition. I believe that metacognition has huge promise in the work we do to narrow the gap for disadvantaged children. Simply defined from my perspective, because it's one of those words you have to define because people have different meanings. For me, metacognition is about children who are able to have knowledge of self as learner and knowledge of task at a strategic level. And that knowledge gives you additional power, an additional learning power. Knowledge of self, the kind of learner I am, knowledge of task at the strategic level. And here are some results that I think are interesting, and I just want to run through them very quickly, some of them. I put them up because I want to explain 2 or 3 things. The first one is called Reflex Ed. Now that is a study that came to us from a group of teachers in schools in South London working with the University College of London. And the teachers came and said, we've been investigating how do you use iPads to better get children to understand their learning and to use it as a tool to record learning style, learning model, learning approach, as well as the task. And we took that lesson, we took that experiment from the teachers with the University College of London and put it to work, as you can see, with 1,000 children. Now, those numbers are important because we think research has to be done in the real world. You have to have quite big numbers. Lab studies are really, really important. But what matters to a teacher, I think, is not necessarily what happens in the lab. It's what happens in a real classroom with the noise and the activity of school around you. And these sort of numbers are now, and we don't regard that as a big trial. For us, that's an efficacy trial. We do that bigger now. So we're very interested in bigger numbers to get real-world experiments before you're able to say to a teacher with some confidence, this is worth you spending your time on. And as you can see, at the end of that study, we do a pre-test, we do a post-test, of course. We randomly assign the schools to the study. We calculate the cost per child for a 1/10 of a standard deviation. That's the cost. And then we award that trial, again, some padlocks. based on attrition, based on concepts like deviation, based on a whole set of the balance at pre-test. We don't allow a binary statistical judgment to rule a test in or out. We say in the round, we need to understand the security of this trial. And I think there's a huge methodological debate we could have about that, I think, in education studies. And then we come out with that result. And we think that has what we call promise. Another study further down, philosophy for children, the reason that's there is because this is one of those activities that suddenly swept through the English education system like wildfire. Everyone started doing it. We said, if everyone's doing it, shall we just check that it works? Education has the habit, I think, if I'm looking around the room, of suddenly getting a fad or fashion. I love mindfulness, but I would like to know if it works before it becomes ubiquitous in our system. So you can take popular things and ask the question of it. And that's why that one's in there. So things come from academics, from labs, they come from teachers, they come from the fact they're becoming available in the system. We evaluate them with independent evaluation using, where we can, randomized controlled trials, which is 95% of our studies. And by the way, the important other thing is that some things don't work. So the justification, at the beginning, people challenged me on the ethics of doing randomized controlled trials. Now we have studies, and it's about 1 in 5 of our studies where the result is negative. We have to say to people, really, the ethical justification is on you. How do you know you're doing no harm unless you're measuring the counterfactual? Because you can do harm. So the ethical challenge is to make sure the counterfactual is in there and that we know that something generally is having impact and doing no harm. Children have no time to waste, especially our most disadvantaged children. Education and the school they get is a one-off opportunity and a golden opportunity, and it can't be wasted by people doing things that have no impact or negative impact. The evidence of scale-up very quickly. This is an example of a trial we did. It goes to the point of diet. We gave breakfast to 10,000 children as they started school. We found that in a randomized trial, we found that the children who had breakfast made more progress in their school, first year of school. Interestingly, not the children who only had breakfast, all the children in the school, even those that didn't take the free breakfast, because the child who was hungry was disrupting the class, was causing more attention on the teacher. All children benefited from the fact that the hungry children were given a breakfast, which is another interesting point in justifying why children in need should be supported from parents who say, well, why are you giving children breakfast? Every family should do that. Why should you reward these families? Because actually it's to everybody's benefit that somebody has breakfast. Here the government pick it up and say that result looks interesting. We're now going to make that available for the whole country. And they put a big chunk of tens of millions of pounds behind it. So you're informing policy as well as hopefully informing practice. We find that the production of individual studies and experiments isn't going to be necessarily the only way you change people's behaviors. When we get clutches of studies like the metacognition or literacy, we've got clutches of studies, parental involvement. Today we release a report all about technology in education. We produce guidance reports in the round. And we say to schools, the evidence in the round has 5 or 6 key recommendations. And here are examples of them. We've done 11 of these guidance reports, which are a gathering of the evidence from our studies, the broader evidence, and bringing that together for practitioners to put to work in their school. And then finally, we find that the very best people to talk about this aren't me on wonderful stages like this. Actually, it's schools talking to schools. So we have a network of schools across England who are our research schools. And those research schools we give extra resources to, and they become a hub, a bit like a teaching hospital. And their job is to communicate the evidence to schools, to walk people through the evidence, to harvest new ideas locally that we can then put into the studies. We have to bring people in to drive this process. And together these create the ecosystem I've described. Finally, one of the most important things for us, and exciting things, and we never had this as an intention, is that there's more and more international interest in our work. And the great thing about that, particularly our work currently in Latin America and Australia, is that we are learning much, much more than we're giving. There is a world of inquiry here and a world of teaching. It's one of the few universal professions in the world. And we have so much to learn from each other if we organize it. So we have some principles about our partnerships and our international work. It's all about equality and dealing with the equity gap. That for us is a moral purpose, the anchor. This is the generation of teachers. If we have any challenge to face, it's that one. How do we tackle inequality across the world in our own systems? We have a commitment to mutual benefit. This is not monetized, it's open source. This is about shared effort. And I think education should demonstrate that in its work together as colleagues. It's about free access to high standard research. And we have to have this debate about what qualifies as high standard research. And finally, it's about working across the network, across this ecosystem of practitioners, academia, and what I call the brokers and politicians in that space. We need to work together as a collaborative. And our partnerships now, as you can see, are beginning to grow around the world, and we're looking forward to growing those even more. If you want to get involved in our work, and we're looking for great ideas from France, I'm sure there's fantastic ideas in practice that we'd like to harvest and bring into our studies so we can share them more widely. There are ways of contacting us, and we have had studies from all over Europe and the rest of the world that we've tested in England schools. We're not, I think it was actually, it reminds me, it was Picasso has said, a good artist borrows, a great artist steals. So we're happy to steal great ideas as we go forward, and I'd welcome any inquiries or further conversation with you. Thank you very much, everybody.
Merci. Donc nous avons eu une présentation d'un dispositif que je trouve assez extraordinaire, de mon côté, en termes de partage, en termes de démarche scientifique, en termes de ressources et d'échanges. Je pense que vous allez avoir de nombreuses questions. Alors, simplement.
Bonjour, merci pour cette présentation. J'ai deux questions. La première, c'est que lorsque vous présentez quel est l'impact de telle ou telle mesure, il y a une similitude frappante avec la méta-analyse de John Hattie sur les pratiques pédagogiques. Donc, est-ce qu'il s'agit des mêmes données? Est-ce qu'il y a des liens entre ces données, ou est-ce que c'est vraiment deux choses totalement séparées qui finalement produisent les mêmes résultats? Et la deuxième question, c'est à propos du peer tutoring. Dans le premier diapo, il était présenté un effet de plus 4, et dans le deuxième, il était présenté un effet de moins 1. J'aimerais bien comprendre peut-être une nuance que je n'ai pas saisie à propos de ça.
So if I can deal with the second question first. In the review of international evidence, you would expect peer tutoring to have high potential. And yet, in this version of peer tutoring, when it was put to work in schools, designed by colleagues at the universities of Manchester and York, it didn't have the impact they or we expected. Now, what that reminds you about, and the value of real-world experiments, what that reminds you is that it isn't what you do, it's the way that you do it. And there might be people in the room who remember Bananarama as a pop group in the 80s. The implementation always trumps the intervention. So just because an idea works somewhere doesn't mean it will work here. You know, everything works somewhere, nothing works everywhere. So that manifestation, that approach to peer tutoring didn't yield the promise. Doesn't mean we don't do it now. Again, we go back and we look at the theory of change, we look at the process study, everything has a process study as well as an RCT, and try and understand why that failed so we can learn from it. And I think there's as much to learn from trials that fail as trials that succeed, and that's the other point. Into your first question, the measurement at the end of the trials largely depends on the proposer's argument about what will change in children. So we then choose measurement which isn't directly related to the implementation, of course. It's a broader. So if someone brings us a program on phonics, we're testing reading. We're not interested in testing phonics, we're interested in testing reading, because that's the purpose of reading. So you have to make sure that there's a generalizable impact or a value for children. And what I didn't mention is that we're increasingly interested in our trials now, not in measuring attainment, but measuring non-academic skills. So we measure self-efficacy, we measure collaboration and group work, we measure creativity. We have other tools now to look at these non-academic outcomes, which I think have high value and potentially going forward in the workplace.
D'autres questions? Moi, j'avais une question. Est-ce que vous êtes souvent sollicité pour le présenter à des acteurs publics, au gouvernement, au Parlement, pour présenter ce que vous faites ou pas?
Yes, we're very honored and privileged to be asked to speak to many governments and agencies around the world. I have it's a question to any audience though, and it goes to my first point that if information or evidence is going to be presented to the community of educators, who is best placed to present that information? Because this is about relationships, this is about trust, it's not about the undeniable truth of logic. In and amongst this are teachers who have a whole set of relationships back to politics, back to government, back to the leadership of their schools. And so in different contexts we find teachers are willing to listen to and be guided by different people. But I do think teaching in the end is quite an intimate act. And you're asking a teacher to change the way they do things. In England, a geography teacher in a secondary school on average teaches about 22,000 lessons in their career. And somehow, with a bit of research, you're going to walk in after 16,000 and suggest that she changes how she teaches. This is not an easy idea. And so the way you present that is going to be about the trust and the confidence they have in the person that's speaking to them. So we should encourage teachers to be skeptical about research, but never cynical. But we should move the profession from where it is, where I think teachers are, in my country, very tired of being told what to do. They are sick and tired of being told what to do, and empower them to take control of their practice. And I think it's knowledge, I think it's evidence which is going to give teachers back their professional status. We do what we do because the evidence tells us, not because we're making it up. And I see it as a great kind of potentially a revolution in education to take power back based on knowledge, not based on whim or story.
Une dernière question?
I will speak in French. Je suis très impressionné par ce que vous proposez et j'aime beaucoup en particulier ce que vous dites sur le fait qu'à la fin la décision repose sur les enseignants qui doivent, avec tout leur jugement, décider si les données qui leur sont présentées leur paraissent pertinentes ou pas. Et hier soir, vous nous parliez d'une chose intéressante qui est que les enseignants ne sont pas tout seuls à prendre cette décision, mais que vous formez ce que vous appeliez des familles d'école, families of schools. Et je me demande si vous vouliez dire un tout petit mot là-dessus, sur ce concept qu'il y a un réseau d'enseignants confrontés aux mêmes problèmes qui sont amenés à prendre les décisions.
One of the I think huge advances in education is the availability of data and big data. And as I know, Stan, you're involved very much in the development of phenomenal data about French education system. The challenge is that data can easily become another stick to beat teachers with. But data needs to be our friend. And what I find in data is that it gives us the chance to begin to look more closely at some of the conditions in which teachers work. And so we've created in England a set of families of schools. Every school in England, we've gathered them with the 50 other schools most like them. We have 24,872 schools in England. And we've gathered them with the 50 schools most like them, based on a whole set of variables. How many children in your school speak English as another language? Remember, that's 23% of England's children. How many children come from families of low income? What is the prior attainment of your children? Schools need to understand that what you're comparing, when you look at the results, are similar conditions. Not apples and pears, but something similar. And once you've got the schools into those families, there is a rich conversation. Because even within the families, every time we do this, we see variation within the families. And we see variation, as you know, the biggest variation is within schools. So that allows us to come to the conclusion that it's not that the children are different, it's that the adults are making different decisions with the children. So how do we as adults learn to make the best decisions? And the Families of Schools strips away some of the sometimes onerous kind of excuses sometimes to say, actually, these children are very similar, and yet this teacher does so much better than you do, Kevin. So why don't you talk to each other and learn? How do we get the same level of progress by making better decisions and working together and learning together? And I think that's how data can be useful to improve. You know, the trick is to be the best at getting better. That's all I want to be, the best at getting better.